I thought I knew what love looked like after 67 years of living. Warm Sunday dinners, children who called just to say hello, the quiet comfort of a home built with sacrifice. But one crisp autumn morning, I discovered my love had been measured in dollar signs. $17,000 to be exact, charged to a credit card I'd given my daughter for emergencies. That emergency, it seemed, was her dream wedding, one I wasn't even invited to celebrate. My son shrugged it off as just money, while his girlfriend treated my kitchen like her personal spa. For years, I had been the safety net, the provider, the silent giver. That morning, staring at the statement on my table, I realized something no one expected. I could cut the net, and when I did, the people who had leaned on me all their lives would fall. I have lived 67 years, but most of them, I realize now, were spent for other people's dreams. My name is Marion Cole, and if you were to walk into my modest 2-story house in Ohio, you'd see the traces of a life built for family. Every choice, every sacrifice stitched into the fabric of these walls. I was 23 when I married Daniel, a quiet man with a warm laugh and big plans for the future. We talked about traveling, opening a small bookstore together, maybe settling near the coast. But life, as it often does, had other ideas. Lila came first, bright-eyed and demanding, and then Brandon, stubborn from the day he was born. Those plans for travel and a bookstore were tucked away, replaced by budgets, school schedules, and a never-ending list of things that always seemed more urgent than my dreams. I taught 3rd grade for 32 years, pouring my patience and energy into other people's children by day and my own by night. We never had much, but I knew how to stretch $1 until it was thin as paper. Every winter, I'd knit scarves and hats to save on buying new ones. Every summer, I'd tend the vegetable garden out back so we could eat fresh without spending extra at the store. When Daniel was diagnosed with lung cancer, the savings we'd scraped together vanished in a blur of hospital bills and prescriptions. I sold my mother's pearl necklace to cover 1 month's insurance gap. I gave up my car and took the bus for nearly 2 years to make sure we could pay for his treatments. And when Daniel passed, I kept everything in the house exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his favorite chair by the window. As if keeping those things the same might anchor me to a life that felt like it had slipped away. Even after he was gone, I told myself I was still needed. Lila had just finished her master's degree and was struggling to pay off loans. Brandon's marriage was falling apart, and he leaned on me for a place to stay, just until things settled. I told myself that being there for them was the reward for all the long nights and hard work. That's what mothers are for, isn't it? There were small joys, of course. Quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and a good book, laughter from the kitchen when the kids came home for dinner, although they came less and less often as the years went by. I found comfort in the familiar routines, mending a hem on Brandon's shirt, baking Lila's favorite pie when she said she was too busy to cook, leaving little envelopes of grocery money on their countertops when I visited. It never occurred to me that my giving might not be seen as love, but as obligation, that the years of sacrificing my time, my comfort, even my health might one day be taken for granted. I remember one evening last winter, a snowstorm had covered the streets, and I stayed up late knitting a blanket for Lila, imagining her wrapping herself in it while grading papers. The next week, when I asked if she'd gotten it, she nodded absently and said it was nice, then changed the subject to ask if I could spot her rent until payday, or the time Brandon mentioned he needed new tires for his car. I quietly dipped into my pension to cover it. When I told him it was taken care of, he barely looked up from his phone, muttering, "Thanks, Mom," like it was just another bill paid. I told myself these were small things, not worth dwelling on. That gratitude came in different forms, and maybe they just weren't good at expressing it. But deep down, I think I was afraid to admit the truth. My life had become an endless chain of giving without expecting anything in return, and without receiving much either. Still, there was pride in knowing I'd done my best. I kept a small box in my bedroom filled with mementos of the sacrifices I'd made, the receipt from the pawn shop where I sold my engagement ring to cover a medical bill, a photo of Daniel and me at the county fair taken the year before he got sick, when I still believed the world was wide open, a faded flyer for a local bookshop that had gone out of business, the one I used to visit to imagine what my own store might look like someday. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that one day my children would look back and see the threads that held their lives together and realize they'd been spun from my hands, that they would understand the value of what had been given to them. But life has a way of teaching you what people truly see when they look at you, and soon I would learn that, in their eyes, my worth had little to do with love and everything to do with what I could provide. 2 months after Daniel's passing, I was sorting through the boxes in our attic, the kind of task you keep putting off because each object carries its own little ghost. Old yearbooks, baby clothes I couldn't bear to part with, and the cardboard box marked in Daniel's neat handwriting, tax records, keep. Inside, tucked between manila envelopes, I found a small leather-bound ledger. It wasn't like Daniel to keep a journal, so my curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, expecting maybe a list of bills or expenses from his last few months. What I found instead made my breath catch. Page after page, Daniel had documented deposits into a separate savings account, one I'd never known existed. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were steady, stretching back nearly 20 years. At the back of the ledger, a final note in his handwriting read, "For Marion, so she'll never have to worry." The account, as I would discover later at the bank, held just over $48,000. I sat in the attic that afternoon, tears blurring the numbers on the page. It was as if Daniel had reached across time to wrap me in one last act of protection. All those years of him insisting we make do or hold off on small luxuries. Now I understood. He'd been building this cushion for me quietly, even as he fought his illness. For weeks afterward, I carried the knowledge of that account like a warm stone in my pocket. It was my safety net, my little secret. I didn't plan to use it unless I truly needed to. Knowing it was there allowed me to breathe a little easier, to sleep a little deeper. When Lila stopped by one evening just to check on me, I welcomed her with tea and the apple pie she loved. We sat in the kitchen and she asked how I was managing the bills on my pension alone. Her voice was sweet, concerned. I felt a wave of gratitude for her thoughtfulness. But then she asked, almost too casually, "Did Dad leave you, anything extra? Life insurance or savings?" The warmth in my chest cooled instantly. "Oh, just the usual," I said, trying to sound breezy. She nodded, smiling faintly, but her eyes flickered with something else. Calculation, maybe. A week later, Brandon called, saying he'd been thinking about Dad and wondering if there were any assets left that we should know about. The "we" wasn't lost on me. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Surely my children's sudden interest in my financial health was born of care, not opportunism. And yet each time I saw them afterward, the conversation seemed to drift, always toward money. Questions dressed up as concern, compliments wrapped around subtle probes. It was a strange whiplash of emotion. On one hand, I wanted to believe they were worried for me, that they wanted to make sure I was secure. On the other, a gnawing doubt had begun to take root. One Sunday, Lila arrived with flowers. "Just because," she said, placing them in a vase. But as we sipped coffee, she steered the talk toward the rising cost of weddings. "It's insane, Mom," she said with a laugh. "Makes you think, if people have the means, why not make things easier for their kids?" Her eyes lingered on me a beat too long. Later that afternoon, Brandon wandered into my living room without knocking, tossing his keys on the table. "Hey, Ma," he said. "I was wondering, do you still have that account Dad used for emergencies? Just curious. I might have an idea for an investment that could benefit all of us." All of us. The words lodged in my chest. That night, alone in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, holding Daniel's ledger. I traced the ink of his handwriting with my fingertip, feeling the love in every stroke. He had meant this for me. Not for weddings or investments or whatever else my grown children imagined. For the first time, I wondered if they saw me as anything more than a conduit to something they wanted. The thought was like a small crack in glass, barely visible, but impossible to ignore. And as I slipped the ledger back into the locked drawer of my nightstand, I told myself it was better to keep my secret exactly that, mine. The morning started quietly enough. I was in the kitchen sorting through the week's mail when the front door slammed, followed by the unmistakable thud of Brandon's boots on the hallway floor. "Ma, I need to borrow your car tonight," he called out, not even stepping into the kitchen. "Rebecca and I are checking out an apartment in Riverside." Rebecca? The yoga instructor who treated my home like it was a wellness retreat, complete with burning sage that made my sinuses flare for hours afterward. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and called back, "Can you come in here a moment?" Brandon appeared in the doorway, already impatient, his phone in hand. His dark hair was tousled in the way that looked intentional, and he wore the expensive jeans I'd bought him for Christmas. I gestured toward the credit card statement lying open on the table. "Did you know about this?" He glanced at the paper, then quickly looked away. A flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Know about what?" he asked. "Your sister charged $17,000 to my card for her wedding," I said. There was a pause before he shrugged, as if I'd mentioned a dent in the car. "Yeah, she might have said something. Look, Mom, it's just money. You can afford it. And Zoe's stressed with the wedding." Just money. The words landed like a slap. "This is my emergency fund, Brandon," I said. "It's not pocket change. It's a loan," he interrupted, glancing at his phone. "She'll pay you back eventually. You've got the house, the pension. You're fine." I stared at my son. This man I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose tears I'd dried. I wondered if he'd always been this dismissive, or if I'd just refused to see it. Something in me tightened. I shifted the conversation abruptly. "When's Lila's engagement dinner? I haven't gotten an invitation." Brandon hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I think they already had it, just a small thing. You know how Lila likes to keep it intimate." The lie sat heavy in the air. My chest felt hollow. Small things, intimate gatherings, family moments where I wasn't considered family enough to be there. It wasn't the first time either. The missed birthdays, the school recitals I only saw in photos, the casual, "oh, it was last-minute" explanations. But this was different. This was her engagement, the start of her new life, and she'd chosen to celebrate it without me. I folded the statement slowly, deliberately. "And the wedding?" I asked. "Of course you're invited," Brandon said, almost scoffing. "Don't be dramatic." Dramatic. As though asking to be included in my own daughter's milestones was an overreaction. I handed him the car keys without another word. "Try to have it back by midnight." "Thanks, Ma," he said, already halfway to the door. "Oh, and Rebecca's staying over tonight. We'll keep it down." When the door closed, the house seemed to sigh around me. I stood in the kitchen, looking at the statement in my hands, feeling the weight of every unacknowledged sacrifice pressing on my ribs. I thought about the winters I'd sat up late sewing costumes for school plays, the summers I'd taken on tutoring jobs so the kids could have new clothes, the nights I'd stayed awake beside Daniel in the hospital, then gone to work the next morning without complaint. And now, in their eyes, all of that seemed to have distilled down to a simple truth. I was here to provide. Transportation, money, a place to land, not a person to be celebrated, not a mother to be honored. I walked into the living room and sank into Daniel's old chair. Outside, the neighborhood carried on. Mrs. Duncan watering her roses, the Morrison kids racing their bikes, everyday life unfolding, ordinary and warm, while mine felt smaller by the minute. The phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Lila. "Hey, Mom, can you pick up some groceries for us? Running late from wedding stuff. Just the usual." "Thanks, just the usual." As if the $17,000 wasn't enough. As if I were her assistant, not her mother. I set the phone face down, pressing my palm against the cool wood of the armrest. I told myself I wouldn't cry. Not for this. But inside, something fragile had shifted. And though I didn't know it yet, that shift was the beginning of the end. That evening, after Brandon had left with the car, the house felt cavernous. I wandered into the hallway to gather a load of laundry, passing by the front window just in time to see Lila's car pulling up at the curb. She didn't come inside. Instead, she stayed in the car, phone pressed to her ear, talking animatedly. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I told myself that. But the windows were open and her voice carried clearly through the quiet evening air. "I just didn't want her there," she was saying, laughter in her tone. "You know how my mom is, she'll make it awkward. Like, we are going for a sophisticated vibe and she'll, I don't know, talk about couponing or her old third-grade class or something. It's just not the aesthetic I'm going for." A pause, followed by her friend's muffled question. "No," Lila said firmly. "I didn't tell her about the dinner. She'd ruin the atmosphere. This is supposed to be chic, elegant. I can't have her sitting there looking out of place. Honestly, she doesn't even know how to talk to Ethan's family. It's better this way." I stood frozen, the laundry basket pressed against my hip, my knuckles white. The words weren't just a door closing. They were a lock turning on the other side. She didn't want me there. Not because of space or scheduling or some polite excuse, but because I embarrassed her. I set the laundry basket down on the floor, the fabric inside suddenly heavy as lead. My mind darted back to the nights I'd stayed up sewing her prom dress because she'd found the store-bought ones tacky, to the way she'd called me in tears from college, and I'd driven 4 hours to comfort her, to the hours I'd spent clipping coupons so we could afford small luxuries, thinking I was teaching her resourcefulness. Now, those same qualities, the frugality, the teacher's stories, the life I had built, were blemishes in her eyes. Things to be hidden away so she could curate her atmosphere. My chest felt tight. For a moment, I thought I might be sick. I reached for the back of Daniel's chair to steady myself, the familiar worn fabric grounding me. Lila's car door opened, and she stepped onto the sidewalk, still laughing into the phone. She didn't see me watching from the shadows of the hallway. Without glancing toward the house, she walked up the street, her voice fading into the distance. I picked up the laundry basket again, though my hands shook now, and carried it to the washer. The sound of the machine filling was oddly comforting, a simple, predictable rhythm in a night that had turned jagged. I was folding the first dry load when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, a tall man in a crisp navy suit stood on the porch, holding a bottle of wine. His dark blonde hair was neatly combed, and there was an easy politeness in his stance. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked. "Yes? I'm Ethan, Lila's fiancé." He extended his hand, and I shook it, surprised by the firm warmth of his grip. "I was just in the neighborhood picking up something for dinner. Thought I'd stop by to say hello. Lila mentioned you weren't feeling well?" That caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I said. "A bit of housework today, that's all." He nodded, his expression attentive in a way I wasn't used to from my own children. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. I've been wanting to thank you for raising such an amazing woman. Lila's told me a lot about how hard you worked for her and Brandon. It means a lot to me, knowing she had such a strong example." For a heartbeat, I didn't know how to respond. The words felt almost foreign. Gratitude, respect, spoken without irony or obligation. "That's kind of you to say," I managed. He smiled, handing me the wine. "This is from my family's vineyard. Thought you might enjoy it, and I know the wedding planning has been intense. If there's ever anything I can do to make things easier for you, please tell me." I thanked him, feeling an unexpected warmth in my chest. The kind that comes when someone sees you as more than just a utility. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the bottle heavy in my hand. The evening air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of Mrs. Duncan's roses from across the street. Lila's words still echoed in my mind, sharp, cutting, deliberate. But now, tangled in that ache was the memory of Ethan's voice. Measured, sincere, and appreciative. It wasn't much, just a seed. But it was enough to make me wonder if, perhaps, there was still someone in this upcoming marriage who might value me for who I was, not for how well I fit into an atmosphere. I placed the bottle on the counter and touched the neck lightly, as though it might whisper some reassurance. It didn't erase the hurt. Nothing could. But for the first time that night, the heaviness in my chest eased, just slightly, as if Daniel himself had sent this small moment to remind me I wasn't invisible. The washer buzzed in the background, life going on, and somewhere deep inside, I decided that I would not be the one to break that rhythm. The days that followed were quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. My phone, which used to buzz with calls, requests mostly, sat untouched on the counter. No grocery lists from Lila, no, "Can you drop me off?" from Brandon. Not even the hollow small talk they used to use to mask their real reasons for calling. It was as if, once I stopped saying yes, my voice was no longer worth hearing. I told myself I should enjoy the silence, that this was what independence sounded like. But in the evenings, when the light faded and the house settled into its creaks and sighs, the quiet became something else entirely, a reminder of absence. I tried to fill the space with small tasks, polishing the kitchen counter until it gleamed, rearranging the books on the shelf by Daniel's old chair, but the memories snuck in anyway, uninvited. Daniel had always been the center of gravity in this house. His laugh could fill a room, his voice steadying me in ways I hadn't appreciated until it was gone. I would catch myself glancing toward the chair, half expecting to see him with the paper folded neatly in his lap, a mug of tea cooling on the side table. Instead, there was only the imprint of what had been, the slight sag in the cushion where he used to sit, the faint scent of his aftershave that lingered years after his passing. I remembered the last winter we had together, how the snow piled high against the windows and the heating bills climbed higher. Daniel had taken my hands in his, calloused and warm, and told me we'd get through it like we always did. And we had, because we were a team. Now without him, it felt like I was carrying both halves of the weight alone. The weekends were the hardest. Before, they had been full of noise. Lila's visits with stories from work, Brandon dropping by with laundry and that sheepish grin he used when he wanted a favor. Even if their reasons weren't pure, at least they came. Now the driveway stayed empty. The only footsteps on the porch were my own. On Sunday afternoon, I made a pot of soup out of habit, the kind Daniel loved with thick chunks of potato and sprigs of fresh thyme from the garden. I ladled a bowl and sat at the table, only to realize I'd set out 2 spoons without thinking. I left the extra one there. Somehow, it felt worse to put it away. Outside, Mrs. Duncan's laughter floated across the street, mingled with the voices of her grandchildren. I watched them chase each other through the garden, their energy spilling into the air like light. It was the kind of sound that used to echo through this house, back when my children still believed home was a place to return to, not a resource to exploit. I thought of calling Lila, just to say hello, to ask how the wedding planning was going. But the image of her in the car, telling her friend I didn't belong, rose up unbidden. The words were still too fresh, their sting too sharp. So I washed the dishes instead, letting the warm water run over my hands until they turned pink. I told myself I didn't need them to call, that I had my own life to tend to. But as the night drew in and the street lights flickered on, the truth settled heavy in my chest. It wasn't just that they weren't calling, it was that they didn't seem to notice my absence at all. The house felt larger than it had any right to be. Every room echoed. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock seemed louder, as if it were counting the seconds between who I had been, the mother always in the middle of things, and who I was now. A woman on the outside, looking in. I carried my mug of tea into the living room and sat in Daniel's chair, curling my legs beneath me the way I used to when we'd talk late into the night. I closed my eyes and let the memories come. The warmth of his hand on mine, the low rumble of his voice, the way he could make me feel seen without a single word. The ache of missing him was a constant now, woven into the fabric of my days. But in moments like this, it flared sharp and unrelenting. I opened my eyes to the dim light of the room, the familiar shadows stretching across the floor, and for the first time, I wondered if this was how it would be from now on, a life defined not by what was present, but by what had quietly, without ceremony, slipped away. Monday morning began with the usual silence, the kettle hissing softly, the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, scrolling idly through my phone. That was when the photo appeared. It was a post from one of Lila's friends, tagged with bright emojis and the caption, "Family love before the big day." The image froze me where I sat. There they were. Lila, radiant in a cream blouse, Ethan with his arm around her, and on the other side, a woman I'd never seen before. Mid-50s, sleek hair, pearl necklace. She stood exactly where I should have been standing, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. The caption beneath the tagged names told me everything. Ethan's mom and our honorary wedding matron. My chest tightened. In the comments, someone had written, "So glad you have such a wonderful mother figure, Lila." Lila had replied with 3 red hearts. Not a single correction, not even a mention of me. It wasn't just that I hadn't been invited to the dinner, I had been replaced. I stared at the woman's smile, warm, effortless, and wondered if she knew the role she'd stepped into, if she knew I was alive, or if in their minds I'd already been written out of the picture entirely. The tea in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted again, another small earthquake in a year already filled with them. I set the phone down, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. That was when I noticed the envelope on the counter, the one I must have brought in with yesterday's mail without opening. The handwriting on the front was familiar, looping and elegant. My heart gave a small leap. Margaret Donnelly. We had been inseparable in high school, the kind of friends who made promises about traveling the world and growing old in matching beach houses. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter, along with a glossy postcard advertising our 50th class reunion. Beneath the invitation was a photo, me and Margaret at 17 leaning against my father's old Chevy. My hair was long then, my smile unguarded, the sunlight catching the edge of my cheek in a way that made me look braver than I'd ever felt. For a moment, I was there again. The summer air smelling of cut grass, the hum of cicadas in the background, Margaret laughing so hard she could barely hold the camera steady. The memory was so vivid it pulled something loose inside me, a reminder of the girl I had been before marriage, before children, before my life became a series of sacrifices I told myself would be worth it. I traced the edge of the photo, feeling the old optimism bloom for just a second. The idea of walking into that reunion, holding my head high, letting them see I was still here, it was tempting. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came. What would I say if they asked about my life now? About my children? My family? Would I admit that my daughter had replaced me in her own narrative? That my son saw me as a convenience more than a person? Would I confess that I lived in a house where the loudest sound was the ticking of a clock because no one came by unless they wanted something? Shame curled in my stomach, sharp and sour. I imagined the polite pity in their eyes, the awkward pauses when my answers didn't fit the expected script. I slid the photo back into the envelope and set it aside. I told myself I'd decide later, but I already knew. I wouldn't go. The kettle had cooled completely now. I carried my untouched tea to the sink, pouring it down the drain, watching the swirl disappear. Outside, Mrs. Duncan's garden was bright with blooms, a contrast so stark it made the inside of my house feel even dimmer. I thought about calling Margaret, about telling her how much that photo had meant, but the phone stayed on the counter. My voice felt too small for the kind of conversation that would follow. Instead, I sat in Daniel's chair, holding the unopened postcard in my lap, the photo tucked inside like a secret I couldn't decide whether to protect or release. I stared at the blank space on the RSVP line, thinking how easy it would be to fill it in. To say yes, to step back into a world where I was more than the sum of what I gave. But the pen stayed capped. Because right now I couldn't imagine walking into a room full of people who remembered me at my brightest, knowing they would see how far I had faded. The afternoon sun was slanting low when I heard the knock. Not the urgent pounding of someone demanding, but a gentle, almost hesitant tap against the back door. Through the glass, I saw her, Elizabeth, from 2 houses down. We'd exchanged polite greetings over the years, comments about the weather or her roses, but never more than that. She stood there holding a casserole dish, her smile uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said when I opened the door. I made too much lasagna and thought, well, eating alone gets old. For a moment, I almost said no. My instinct lately had been to keep the world at a distance, but something in her eyes, maybe the fact that she'd noticed I was alone, softened me. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent so many evenings staring at bills and unanswered text messages. Elizabeth poured wine from the bottle she'd brought, the glasses catching the last golden light of the day. "I saw some commotion the other morning," she said carefully. "Raised voices, a young man leaving with suitcases." I nodded. "My son." She didn't press, just waited, her attention steady. And before I knew it, the whole story came spilling out. The credit card charges, the exclusion from Lila's engagement dinner, the feeling of being useful but not valued. Elizabeth listened without interruption, without judgment. When I paused, she refilled my glass and said quietly, "It sounds exhausting." "It's been years," I admitted, always saying yes, thinking it meant I mattered. But now, I'm not sure I ever did, at least not in the way I thought. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "my sister used to be like that, always giving, always smoothing things over. She thought it was love. Maybe it was, but it also made her invisible. The people she helped stopped seeing her as a person. She had to step away before they noticed her absence." The words hit me harder than I expected. I've been living in that space for so long, the quiet erasure, the slow drift into invisibility, that I hadn't named it. "I'm afraid of what will happen if I stop," I confessed. "If I stop helping, maybe they'll stop coming altogether." Elizabeth gave a small smile. "And what if they only come because you help? What if they never really come for you?" I stared at her, the truth of it settling heavy and undeniable. She took a slow sip of wine. "Your value isn't in what you give. It's in who you are. And if they can't see that, then it's their loss, not yours." For a long time, we just sat there in the comfortable quiet that comes when someone understands you without needing to fix you. I realized I hadn't felt that in years. The lasagna was rich and fragrant, the kind of meal you linger over, and we did, talking about her garden, about the stray cat that had adopted her, about the strange comfort of a well-worn neighborhood. As the evening stretched on, I found myself laughing, not the polite kind I used with my children to smooth over some careless remark, but a laugh that came from somewhere deeper. When she finally left, promising to bring the dish back tomorrow, I stood at the door watching her walk down the path, the porch light casting a warm halo around her. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. I sat in Daniel's chair, thinking about what Elizabeth had said. Your value isn't in what you give. I'd built my entire identity on the idea that giving was the proof of my worth. Without it, who was I? Maybe that was what I needed to find out. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the seconds. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like they were slipping away from me. They felt like something I could use. I thought about the photo from Margaret, still in its envelope on the counter. Maybe I wouldn't go to the reunion, but maybe I'd start showing up for myself in other ways. And maybe, just maybe, I'd stop waiting for permission to matter. The next afternoon, Elizabeth returned with my casserole dish and a plate of lemon bars. "You didn't think I'd just drop lasagna and run, did you?" she said with a wink. We settled at the table again, the lights softer now with clouds rolling in. It felt natural, like we'd been having these conversations for years. Somewhere between bites of lemon bar, she leaned forward. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday," she began, "about my sister." Her tone shifted. Quieter, heavier. For years, she lived off me. Not in an obvious way, it was always something temporary. Staying at my place for a month that turned into a year, borrowing money she'd pay back soon, but never did. She used my kindness as a ladder, and I thought, well, that's what family does. But one day I realized I was exhausted. Worse, I was resentful, and she didn't even notice. "What happened?" I asked, leaning in. "I cut contact," Elizabeth said simply. "No dramatic fight, no big announcement. I just stopped answering every call, stopped solving every crisis. The first months were hard. The guilt, it ate at me. But eventually the quiet turned into peace. And that peace, I wouldn't trade it for anything." Her words settled deep inside me, like a stone dropping into still water. I thought about how much of my own life had been given over to solving other people's problems, to keeping a door open, no matter how many times it was walked through without thanks. Before I could respond, the faint sound of voices drifted in through the open kitchen window. It was coming from the sidewalk out front. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Sounds like Lila." I moved to the window, careful not to be seen. There she was, standing beside Ethan's car, talking to him with her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "I just don't get it," Ethan was saying. "Why wouldn't you invite your mom to the engagement dinner? She's your only parent." Lila glanced around, lowering her voice, but the quiet street carried her words. "Because she doesn't fit, Ethan. She'd make it awkward. You know how she is. She doesn't blend in with everything we're trying to do." Ethan looked troubled. "She's your mother. Isn't that the point? Family?" Lila shrugged, her tone sharp now. "I don't need her making comments about how much things cost or showing up in one of her old cardigans. It's not the image I want for the wedding." I felt the breath leave my body. Elizabeth had moved to stand beside me. She didn't speak, but her hand brushed lightly against my arm, grounding me. Ethan's voice was tight. "You realize she's been paying for half of this, right? The deposits, the flowers." "I told you, it's not about the money," Lila interrupted quickly. "It's about the vibe. Just drop it." They got into the car, the conversation swallowed by the closing doors. For a moment, I stood frozen, the truth sitting cold and heavy in my chest. All those years, I thought my sacrifices were invisible. But no, they weren't invisible. They were simply unappreciated. My presence wasn't just unwanted, it was actively avoided. Elizabeth's voice was gentle but certain. "You heard it with your own ears. You don't need to question anymore." And she was right. There was no mistaking the meaning, no room left for the small mercies I'd been giving myself, the polite excuses, the imagined misunderstandings. It wasn't about not being invited. It was about being erased. The realization was both shattering and clarifying. Pain bloomed sharp in my ribs, but threaded through it was a strange lightness. The kind that comes when the fog finally clears and you can see exactly where you stand. Elizabeth poured me another glass of wine without asking. When I heard my sister say something similar about me once, I thought I'd never recover. But here I am, and here you are, and you will recover, probably stronger than before. I met her eyes. I think I'm starting to believe that. We sat in silence for a while, the wind rattling the windows. I could still hear Lila's voice in my head, the sharp edge of it, the way she'd so casually dismissed me. It hurt. God, it hurt. But I knew now there was no going back to the way things were. I had seen the truth, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The morning air was cool and sharp, the kind that wakes you up before the coffee does. I stood in my kitchen, the credit card company's letter open on the counter. The charges were officially reversed, $17,000 wiped away, at least on paper. But the real debt, the years of being taken for granted, could never be erased. I placed the letter neatly in a folder labeled Important Documents. Then I picked up the phone and called the locksmith. By noon, the old brass locks on my front and back doors lay in a small pile on the kitchen table. The new locks clicked into place with a solid, satisfying sound. The locksmith handed me 2 keys. "Keep one in a safe place," he said, "and don't give copies to anyone you don't completely trust." For the first time in years, that list was short. The next call was to the bank. "I'd like to remove an authorized user from my accounts," I told the woman on the line. She was polite, efficient. Brandon's debit card access would be terminated by the end of the day. No more temporary withdrawals that never found their way back. After hanging up, I walked through the house with a strange sense of possession. The walls seemed sturdier. The air felt lighter. This space was mine again. I decided to keep going. In the attic, dust motes danced in the shafts of light as I sorted through boxes. I pulled out the antique lamp Daniel had bought me on our 10th anniversary, the one I'd tucked away when Lila said it looked dated. I placed it back in the living room, exactly where it belonged. The real surprise came when I opened the cedar chest at the far end. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper, were the first editions of books I'd once dreamed of selling in my own little bookstore. I'd given up that dream to pay for Brandon's failed landscaping business, and later, for Lila's graduate school tuition. I spent the rest of the afternoon dusting them off, lining them on the shelf, running my fingers over the embossed covers. They were mine. The dream might be smaller now, but it wasn't gone. In the following days, I began to change my routines. Instead of waiting for a phone call that never came, I walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I bought fresh herbs for my garden and a small lemon tree that I planted in the backyard, just outside the kitchen window. I joined the local literacy club, volunteering twice a week to help adults learn to read. The first time a man in his 50s stumbled over a sentence and then looked up at me with pure, unfiltered pride when he got it right, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose, untied to anyone's demands. Elizabeth became my regular coffee companion. We met in the mornings, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. She brought cuttings from her roses. I shared the first herbs from my garden. We didn't talk much about my children unless I brought it up, and I found myself bringing it up less and less. The quiet was different now. Not the hollow emptiness of being forgotten, but the steady calm of having space to breathe. One afternoon, while pruning the lemon tree, I caught myself humming. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. It wasn't that I didn't think about Lila and Brandon. I did. I wondered if they noticed the silence from me, if they missed the constant stream of support they'd once taken for granted. But I didn't dwell. My life wasn't orbiting theirs anymore. I had my garden, my books, my club, and the slow, steady work of reclaiming my space, both the one with walls and the one inside my own mind. There was no announcement, no declaration to the world. No one needed to know what I was doing or why. It was enough that I knew. The first sign of spring was in the air, soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, the faint scent of blooming magnolia trees from down the street. I was watering my lemon tree when the sound of tires crunching on the driveway made me glance up. Ethan's car. I opened the door to find him standing there, his posture tentative, a large envelope in his hands. "Mrs. Cole," he said, voice steady but respectful. "Do you have a moment?" I gestured him inside, noting the dark circles under his eyes. We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where so many hard conversations had taken place over the years. "I wanted to come by in person," he began. "The wedding, it's not happening." I studied his face. "Are you all right?" He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Better than I should be. I called it off." He slid the envelope toward me. "And this is for you." I opened it to find a cashier's check, far larger than I expected, $9,000. "I can't take this," I started, but he shook his head. "You can and you should. Half of that $17,000 charge went to things for me, too. The venue deposit, catering tastings, suits. I benefited from money that wasn't mine, and I can't walk away knowing I didn't make it right." His words carried a sincerity that caught me off guard. No excuses, no deflection, just responsibility. I placed the check back in the envelope, my fingers lingering on its edges. "Thank you, Ethan. You didn't have to?" "Yes, I did," he interrupted softly. "Lila might never see it, but I do. You deserved better." When he left, the house was silent again, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. That night, I sat at my desk and stared at the check. I could put it into savings. I could let it sit as a cushion, untouched. But another thought had been tugging at me for weeks, ever since I'd unpacked my old first edition books, the dream I'd buried decades ago, a small bookstore, the kind with mismatched chairs and the smell of coffee in the air, a place where people linger. By the next morning, I was standing in front of a vacant corner shop 3 blocks from my house. Its windows were dusty, the inside dim, but I could already see it in my mind. Shelves along the walls, a counter with an espresso machine, a reading nook by the big window. The realtor showed me around. The rent was surprisingly reasonable, the space perfect for something modest. My hands trembled as I signed the lease, using part of Ethan's check for the deposit. I didn't tell Lila. I didn't tell Brandon. In fact, I told no one except Elizabeth, who listened with a slow smile spreading across her face. "Keeping it to yourself?" she asked. "For now," I said. "It's mine. I don't want it to be anyone else's business until it's real." The next few weeks were a blur of paint swatches, secondhand furniture hunts, and late nights online learning how to operate a commercial coffee machine. Elizabeth helped scrub shelves. The man from the hardware store cut planks to make extra bookcases. The smell of fresh paint and roasted beans began to replace the mustiness in the air. I chose a name, Second Chapter. It felt fitting. On opening day, I flipped the sign to open with no fanfare. There was no ribbon cutting, no announcement in the local paper. Just me behind the counter, watching as the first curious neighbor stepped inside. A woman from the flower shop down the street ordered a cappuccino and left with 2 paperback novels. A teenager came in after school, browsed for nearly an hour, and promised to return for the next volume in his series. I worked the small space from morning to evening, the register's soft chime and the quiet murmur of conversation wrapping around me like a long-forgotten comfort. There was power in the secrecy, knowing I had created something without permission, without anyone else's hand in it. My children didn't know I had a key to another door now, one they had no control over. One evening, as I wiped down the counter, I realized I was smiling. Not because someone had approved of me or thanked me or leaned on me, but because I had built something of my own, from the ground up. I locked up and walked home under the warm glow of the street lamps, the night air crisp and alive. The check from Ethan was nearly gone, but what it had bought me was worth more than the number printed on it. Not just a shop, not just a dream resurrected. Freedom. And I didn't need anyone's blessing to keep it. The bell over my shop door chimed as I arranged a new stack of novels near the front display. I'd just finished brewing a fresh pot of coffee when the air shifted. That subtle weight in the room that comes when the past walks in. Lila stood in the doorway. Her hair was messy, her eyes rimmed red. Brandon trailed behind her, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets. "Mom, Lila said softly, as if unsure whether she was allowed to speak the word. I placed the coffee pot back on the warmer. Lila, Brandon. For a long moment, none of us moved. Outside, the street bustled with ordinary life. Someone walking their dog, a delivery truck pulling up to the bakery. Inside, time felt like it had slowed. We need to talk, Brandon said, his voice rough. I gestured toward the small table by the window. They sat, shifting uncomfortably like strangers in a waiting room. What's going on? I asked, keeping my tone even. Lila's fingers twisted in her lap. The rent went up on my apartment. David's gone. I can't cover it on my salary. I thought maybe I could stay with you just for a little while. Brandon glanced at her, then added, and my hours got cut at work. I'm behind on bills. My car's in the shop. I figured maybe you could help. I finished for him. He nodded. I leaned back, letting their words settle. Not long ago, I would have jumped to fix it all, sold something, rearranged my budget, sacrificed my own stability to keep them afloat. But now, I'm sorry you're both struggling, I said, but I can't give you money, and you can't move back in with me. Their heads snapped up in unison. What? Lila's voice cracked. I don't have the space, and even if I did, it wouldn't be good for any of us. You're adults. These are your responsibilities to handle. Brandon frowned. We're your kids. You've always... Yes, I interrupted gently. I have always helped, even when it hurt me. But that's not love. That's enabling. I'm not doing that anymore. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. Lila's eyes filled, but I didn't see the calculated tears of the past. This was something rawer. Maybe anger, maybe shame. So that's it? You're just done with us? No, I said. I'm here if you want advice, if you want to talk, if you want to rebuild a relationship based on respect, but I'm not here as a safety net for your finances. Brandon scoffed. Sounds cold. It sounds like boundaries, I replied, and boundaries are not cold. They're necessary. Outside, a man with a stroller paused to look through the shop window, smiling at the display. The moment grounded me. A reminder that life went on, that not every connection had to be tangled with guilt and obligation. Lila looked around the shop then, as if really seeing it for the first time. This is yours? Yes, I said simply. Her gaze softened, curiosity flickering behind the exhaustion. When did you... A few months ago. You didn't tell us. No, I said. I didn't. Brandon shifted, uncomfortable. Why not? Because it wasn't about you. It was about me. They didn't seem to know how to respond to that. After a while, Lila stood. I guess we should go. You're welcome to stay for coffee, I offered. She hesitated, then shook her head. Not today. Brandon muttered something under his breath, already heading for the door. I watched them leave, their figures blending into the flow of pedestrians until they were gone. The bell chimed again as a regular customer came in, and I shifted back into motion, pouring coffee, recommending books, chatting about the weather. Later, after the last customer left and the shop was quiet, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table by the window. The evening light painted the street in gold, and through the glass, I could see the lemon tree in the distance, its leaves catching the glow. I thought about Lila and Brandon, about the conversation we just had. It hurt, of course it did, but beneath the ache was a steady calm. I had not yelled. I had not begged. I had not folded. I had stayed true to my boundaries, and that, I realized, was a kind of love, too. Not the smothering, sacrificial love I'd practiced for decades, but a love that allowed space for growth, even if that growth was uncomfortable. I sipped my tea and let the quiet fill me. The shop smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of scent that seeps into your bones. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The week after Lila and Brandon came to the shop, the news reached me in pieces. First came Ethan. I spotted him across the street while sweeping the front steps one morning. He crossed over, his expression polite but drawn. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. "I called off the wedding." For a moment, I just blinked at him. "She never told me about the debt," he continued, "or the credit card, or the fact that she'd been leaning on you for years. I found out when I saw an overdue notice for a loan in her name." He exhaled slowly. "I loved her, but I can't marry someone who hides things like that." There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion. I nodded. "I'm sorry, Ethan." He shook his head. "Don't be. I think maybe this is the wake-up call she needed. I just hope she takes it." Why? When he left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him disappear into the crowd, thinking about how endings often look less like slammed doors and more like slow, quiet exits. The second piece of news came 2 days later, from Elizabeth over our morning coffee. "I heard from the community board that Brandon lost his job at the auto shop," she said, lowering her voice. "Apparently, the owner caught him taking cash advances from the register without permission. He says it was just a temporary borrow, but they let him go on the spot." I closed my eyes briefly. "And his girlfriend?" "She moved out last week, took the dog, too." It should have shocked me. Instead, it felt like the inevitable consequence of years of skirting responsibility. I didn't call either of them. Life in the shop moved forward. Mornings began with the hiss of the espresso machine and the warm scent of fresh cinnamon scones. Customers wandered in and out, lingering over novels or chatting about their day. The lemon tree in the back garden had begun to sprout tiny white blossoms, a quiet reminder that growth often happens slowly, invisibly, until one day it was undeniable. Then, one golden late afternoon, the last twist arrived. I was behind the counter handing a book to a customer when movement outside caught my eye. Lila. She stood across the street at first, half hidden behind a lamppost, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. A tote bag hung from her shoulder, but she didn't move toward the shop. Her gaze swept over the window display, then up toward the sign above the door. She crossed to my side of the street, stopping just short of the entrance. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. There was hesitation in her stance, the way her hand hovered near the door handle, but never quite touched it. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her face bare of makeup, her shoulders slightly hunched. 100 possible dialogues flashed through my mind, words I could say, invitations I could offer, but none felt right. Instead, I turned back to the customer, finished ringing up their purchase, and handed over their change with a smile. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lila shift her weight, glance down the street, then back at me. I met her gaze again, and this time, I let a small, gentle smile curve my lips. Not an invitation, not a dismissal, just acknowledgement. The sunlight slanted through the front windows, catching dust motes in its path, wrapping the space in a warm, golden glow. It touched the spines of the books, the steam curling from a forgotten cup of tea, the soft edges of everything I had built here. When I looked back, Lila was still there. But after a moment, she turned and walked away, blending into the late afternoon crowd. I didn't follow. The customer thanked me and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind them. The bell's soft chime faded into the comfortable hum of the shop. I moved to the front table, straightening a stack of paperbacks, my fingers brushing over the covers like familiar friends. There was a strange kind of peace in that moment, knowing she had been close enough to step inside but hadn't, knowing I had been close enough to call her back but didn't. Some things don't need grand speeches. Some endings and beginnings are quieter than that. Outside, the light deepened into amber, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been painted in memory. I stood there, hands resting on the counter, and let the silence say what words never could. No reconciliation, No final blow, just a space where two lives had diverged, each carrying their own choices, their own weight. And in that quiet, I felt something shift, not between us, but within me. The bell chimed again, and a new customer entered, asking about a mystery novel Elizabeth had recommended. I smiled, gestured toward the shelves, and stepped back into the rhythm of my life. Because this was my life now, and it was enough.